Things started off hot for the offense in Nashville, but the Seahawks couldn't get the job done in preseason game number 2, falling to the Titans. Connor Benintendi and I are going to be breaking it all down here on our latest post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here for our latest post-game installment by my co-host, Connor Benintendi, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Bainbridge Island, Washington, or over in Memphis, Tennessee. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Mike Macdonald era now has a loss in the win-loss column. The Seahawks were ahead at halftime against the Titans today at Nissan Stadium, but unfortunately, this is the preseason, and the preseason is going to preseason. Even though Jason Myers put Seattle back ahead 15-13 with under 2 minutes to play, the Titans answered back behind Mason Rudolph, who at this point, it's a curse. He just has it for the Seahawks, whether it's regular season or preseason. So Seahawks fall to 1-1. As is the case anytime you look at a preseason game, Connor, I think we have to look at this from a big picture with a big grain of salt, because really for 2 quarters, the guys that have a chance to make this football team, most of the players that are going to have a chance to make this football team, played pretty well. And the Seahawks were up 12-7, not a commanding lead by any means, but it was at least a rock solid first half before things kind of unraveled after halftime.
Yeah, I'm not putting too much weight in the result on this, Corbin, and that's, something obviously we've been writing about all week. Is after we learned that most of the starters wouldn't be playing in this game, I kind of knew that there wouldn't be much to put into whatever came out of this game in terms of what the actual score was, Corbin. The starters for this game particularly looked pretty good. Obviously, Sam Howell showed pretty good command of Ryan Grubb's offense. We like what we saw out of him. And overall, I think that whatever you saw out of that defense in the second half, a lot of those guys, unfortunately, are not going to be on this roster. I know that you tweeted about it and I tweeted about it, Corbin, but obviously you saw the interception from Ty Okada, and I really like what I've seen out of Ty Okada particularly, but I just don't think there's a place for him on this roster. And that's where we're getting down to the nitty gritty here of these final preseason games, where you have some of these players who are making plays. They look good, but some of these position groups are so tight right now that there's just some of these guys that are not going to be able to land on this roster. And this defense overall, obviously in the second half, like you said, Corbin, was pretty porous. And I don't like what I saw out of that defense there later in the game, but there's room for improvement. There's a lot of things that some of those guys were doing well, especially on the defensive front. But overall, a loss is a loss, and I'm sure Mike Macdonald isn't happy about the way that this thing panned out.
No, being a coach that is really all about the details, what this game boiled down to, yeah, the Titans had over 300 yards of offense, and they had the football almost 40 minutes in this game, and a lot of that was the second half. It felt like the Seahawks never had the football on offense in the second half because they got 2 first downs on offense the final 2 quarters. And I'm sure we'll talk more as this show evolves about how poor the offense played and what we believe is the big reason for that in those last 2 quarters. But Seattle had 6 penalties on defense in the second half, and 3 of those extended drives. 4 first downs for the game picked up on penalties, 3 of them being in the second half. And so that's got to be eaten at Mike Macdonald. Last week, the tackling was pretty darn good. This week, not so much. First half, it was fairly decent. There was a few misses there. Second half, a lot of tackles left on the field. There were missed sack opportunities throughout this game. So those are going to be 2 things that are really eating at Mike Macdonald. Missed tackles, you can't have that. And then these deflating penalties, a number of them coming on 3rd down as well. Patrick O'Connell had a defensive holding penalty. It was clearly a penalty. It should have been flagged, but that was 3rd and 2. And that led to another field goal for the Titans that gave them their first lead of the game in the 4th quarter. So Those are some things that are going to eat at Mike Macdonald that might make it a little tougher to fall asleep tonight, even though a lot of those players, they are battling mostly for practice squad spots at this point, or to get on another roster. Still, these are guys that have been in training camp with Mike Macdonald and his staff. That is not acceptable, and there were still more mistakes than I expected. There were a couple coverage breakdowns by the defense in the first half that Malik Willis just didn't take advantage of. There was a gimme touchdown downfield where Kayvon Wallace and Kobe Bryant did not look like they were on the same page, and there was a receiver running wide open, but Malik Willis just completely missed him, and that's probably why he's going to be in the CFL in a couple weeks, because he's missing plays like that. But nonetheless, there were some positives on defense. I felt like this was a little bit of a step back compared to what we saw last week, but the Titans were giving them some better looks. You had better quarterbacks that had starting experience that you were going against. Offensively, though, to me, what really matters coming out of this game is what we saw from Sam Howell, going 11 for his last 13, throwing the football, and a second straight week, no turnovers. He did have a fumble in this game, and thank goodness Stone Forsythe got on top of that ball. I mean, he let the guy hit Sam Howell, so the least he can do is recover the fumble. But otherwise, another really spotless performance from Sam Howell, and he just looks more and more comfortable running this team. You got good running behind your mostly first string offensive line. You had a number of backups in there as well. So I think there were a lot of positives on offense. I'd like to finish more drives than he did, but still getting a field goal late in the final 38 seconds, that was a masterful drive by Sam Howell. Those were the big positives that I think at the end of the day are going to matter most, because a lot of the guys who were making those plays are at least going to be on Seattle's roster when they're playing the Broncos on September 8th.
Yeah, I think that first half, Corbin, is so important to focus on, because that's a lot of the immediate backups that if we do have injuries, if Seattle does have certain things arise, whatever it might be, somebody isn't available. A lot of the guys that you saw in the first half, both on offense and defense, are going to be the guys who are filling in pretty quickly there for this team. And that's important, because we do have, Sam Howell. I mean, some people were so low on Sam Howell just through training camp and everything else and everything that's transpired. But Sam Howell has been so good these first couple preseason games. We saw in the first one there were some shaky points. But in the second one, I think he looked a little bit anxious whenever he came out of the gates there. And then overall, it seems like a confidence just continued to grow throughout the game. Obviously, on that touchdown throw to Aesop Winston was just a beautiful ball, Corbin. That was a beautiful ball. That's as good as you could possibly put it on that fade route. And Aesop Winston, obviously, as we're going to talk about, did a great job there, showing his hands late, being able to reel that ball in. And overall, just on that second throw to Cody White there on the next drive, I believe it was, 33-yard catch. It was just right between two Titans defenders. That thing was on a rope. And that's what you want to see out of Sam Howell, particularly as he continues to get acquainted with this offense, is just the confidence, right? Like we know Sam Howell has been a proven starter in the NFL. He's done things in the NFL. He's started games. He's thrown touchdowns. He's completed many passes, thrown for many yards. The difference has been whether or not he can get acquainted to this offense. We know he can play NFL football, but it's whether or not he can get into this Ryan Grubb scheme. And that's been throughout training camp one of the biggest questions, right, Corbin, is whether or not he can get comfortable in this space. And I feel like this game was a really, really good proving point for him about whether or not he's going to have longevity in this offense, and I think he will. And overall, like you said, the penalties just in that second half were killer for this team. And I think, obviously, as we're also going to talk about, Corbin, is DJ James with two of those penalties on one drive was brutal for this team. And that's really what killed it overall. But and one of the other things that I wanted to touch on was just the time of possession. Obviously, we come from last week where we had Seattle had almost a 2-to-1 time possession. And now it completely almost flipped on its head. And I'm very curious almost on your thoughts on this, Corbin, of why this happened. Obviously, a lot of this happened with P.J. Walker controlling the offense and just drives stalling out overall. And it just didn't look as fluid as when Sam Howell was controlling this offense. But I'm a little bit curious as to what you thought maybe changed a little bit there, Corbin, there in the second half, and why the time of possession flipped so much on its head.
It's all about the buffet bashers. That's what it boils down to. The offensive line. Now, the first two possessions to start this game, it looked like it was going to be a long night because Stone Forsythe got beat on that play, tripped up by Kenny McIntosh. That is still the Achilles heel for Kenny McIntosh. The pass pro stuff is still, as a former running back coach, that is eating at me watching that. But nonetheless, you had that forced fumble that ended up being recovered the drive before. Howell's only pass attempt. He had his arm hit by a rusher that quickly got into the backfield. But that O-line really calmed down after that point. And the touchdown to Easop Winston, that was as picturesque of a pocket as you're ever going to see. Sam Howell looked like he was throwing at OTAs when he lofted that football. And they were able to get some movement up front with the run game. When the third string offensive line came in, they weren't getting either of those things. They weren't getting pass protection for P.J. Walker, and they certainly weren't getting any movement in the run game. Everybody that checked in at running back was getting blown up before they were able to even get a head of steam downfield. So it really was the offensive line, I think, was the biggest factor there. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we get deeper into this post-game podcast. Coming up next, it's time to dish out our game balls. Even in defeat, you've got your winners on offense, defense, and special teams, and maybe an extra game ball for this particular game. We'll get to those coming up next here on our post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates as possible to interview. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs is the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. As a site manager on Seahawks on SI, LinkedIn Jobs is my go-to to post writing positions to land top candidates. They've made the process easy and seamless, and LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is so easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier, and they even recently launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedInNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedInNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined for tonight's episode by my co-host, Connor Benintendi. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in on this fine Saturday night. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks falling to 1-1 in preseason play. They were ahead at halftime in Nashville, but unfortunately, the wheels fell off on offense, penalties galore on defense, and they end up falling in the closing seconds, 16-15 to the Titans. Connor, let's get to our weekly game balls, and there were plenty of worthy candidates in all three phases of the game. We're going to start on offense, and I know being in the state of Washington, you decided it's time to give a Cougar a little bit of love today on our podcast.
Yeah, Easop Winston Jr. was too good in this game not to give him a game ball, Corbin. Obviously, the 23-yard touchdown reception from Sam Howell was the highlight of the day for Easop Winston. But, you know, there's more to that play than just the touchdown reception. And as I talked about a little bit before the break there, Corbin, it's just the ability for him to burn the corner in one-on-one coverage and then be able to show his hands late on a perfect – and don't get me wrong, the throw from Sam Howell had to be where it was for that play to be what it was. But the fact that he was able to show his hands late, keep the corner, waiting to see what was going to happen. He didn't know that the ball was coming, and Easop Winston just happened to be able to secure that ball there at the last second. And overall, Easop Winston finished with 3 receptions for 47 yards and a score. He leads all Seahawks receivers. It's difficult not to give him a game ball in this regard, and obviously he's competing with Derek Young for potentially the 6th spot there on the 53-man roster in terms of receivers. So I don't want to say that this necessarily shakes up that competition, Corbin. I know you're very high on Derek Young, and so am I. But I think that this is a similar situation to where obviously we have Kenny McIntosh competing with George Holani at running back, and we see George Holani get less snaps overall than Kenny McIntosh, and we saw Derek Young get less snaps overall than Aesop Winston Jr. I think they wanted to see more from Winston in this game to see if he's going to reignite that competition. And I think overall he made a good case to reignite that competition, but I'm not sure if it's enough for him to land on the roster. I'm very curious to see how this competition is going to shake out. Overall, great performance from Aesop Winston. The fact that he's even still in this competition, it's really between him and Young at this point.
Yeah, it feels like it's a two-horse race. I mean, Cody White's done some good things as well, but I got to talk again about the guy that made the throw. And look, we've had plenty of listeners on here like, why are you so down on Sam Howell? Like, if anybody listened to this podcast when the trade was made back in March, like, I have always been high on Sam Howell. That is why I was disappointed by what I saw early in training camp. And it wasn't like it was a 1 or 2 practice thing. This was a consistent issue for him, the accuracy, airmailing throws, but he really is starting to settle down now. And today was easily the best that I've seen him look in a Seahawks uniform. 153 passing yards, 136 passing rating, almost 80% completion rate. And we can talk over and over again about how perfect that touchdown pass was. It was fantastic. But there were 2 other plays that stood out as the top plays to me from Sam Howell today. The first one being that absolute laser that he threw to Cody White down the seam, and you couldn't really loft that pass because that would have given the oncoming safety a little bit too much time to at least get their hands on the football, or you'd be hanging your receiver out to dry. So he couldn't put much air under it, but then you also had a defender underneath that was in tight coverage. So if you were going to fit this ball in, it had to be thrown perfectly, and he needed it in there. It was a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. And the other play that really stood out to me happened a few plays before the touchdown to Winston. It was 3rd and 3, and the Titans had 3 rushers that got into the backfield. They blitzed. They had extra pressure coming, and Sam Howell was able to evade those rushers, step up in the pocket. This is the mobility that he brings to the equation. Steps up in the pocket and dumps it off to A.J. Barner, who turns up field and gets 17 yards on the play. That extended the drive and gave him that chance to have that touchdown to Aesop Winston. So you saw the arm strength, you saw the arm talent, you saw the mobility, the ability to get away from rushers in the pocket, and I just love the decision-making we're seeing. Knock on wood, there has not been a throw in these first 2 games where I was like, oh, that's a touchdown or interception waiting to happen, which that happened so much to him last year in Washington. It just feels like he really is grasping the offense, and now we're starting to see him settle down accuracy-wise. So he's getting my game ball in offense. And oh, by the way, he had 2 rushes for 11 yards too, so a little bit more of that mobility here. On the defensive side of the ball, I know that you had to wait till later in the game to make your selection this one, but a player that you've been very high on in this entire process was one of the few bright spots in the second half.
Yeah, and overall, I think one of the biggest things with Mike Morris specifically is just the amount of snaps he played in this game and the fact that he was consistent throughout the game, Corbin. That's one of the things that this coaching staff is going to be looking at, is just in terms of the durability, the consistency, and overall just the conditioning of these players. How long can you go? And Mike Morris was in there pretty early in the game making plays throughout as well. He may not have been getting the tackles, but he was consistently pushing that pocket, and he continued to do so throughout the game. He was playing in there, I think, into the 4th quarter, Corbin, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. He was just continuing to go and go and go, and that's what you want to see out of a defensive tackle who's trying to make this team, the fact that he was able to just keep going and going. He finished with 3 tackles, 2 solo tackles. He also had 1 tackle for loss, 1 sack that was credited to him.
And he overall, fought through a hold on that sack too.
Exactly. And it was just a solid game from this guy. And this is somebody who came into this training camp, obviously kind of on the bubble, not really sure where his place was going to be. And as the depth has sort of shaken out over the preseason, Mike Morris has just continued to improve and improve and improve. And he's obviously he has the ties to Mike McDonald from Michigan, which certainly helps in this situation. But overall, like this is not a situation where the ties to the head coach are the only reason he's continuing to get more opportunities. This is a situation where Mike Morris has been an impressive player, and he's going to be a rotational defensive lineman for Seattle. I don't want to call him a roster lock at this point, but I think he's right there on the borderline of a roster lock, just because this defensive line has especially dealt with some injuries here, and obviously just even on the outside linebacker position and everything else. So many things have been sort of in sway here these last couple of weeks, but overall, Mike Moore is just continuing to hammer every single drive. He's getting good pressure. He's collapsing the pocket. I was really excited about what I saw from him today.
I was excited about what I saw from Derek Hall, and some might be saying, hey, didn't you talk about him last week? But I let you have him last week for the game ball. He is getting my game ball this week because right from the outset, Derek Hall, the first 3 snaps of this game, they ended up listing it as a tackle at the line of scrimmage. I've watched the replay 3 times since the game ended. It was a 1-yard loss. The refs poorly spotted that ball. It was a tackle for loss against the run, setting the edge. Very next play, he gets a sack. He immediately gets after Malik Willis. He had 2 other pressures in this game, 3 tackles. Number 58, he is having, I rarely am going to say this, he is having a transformative training camp and preseason. We are seeing a young player just blossom in front of our eyes. And I know it's the preseason, but I've watched this dude do this in training camp against Seattle starters. Like, this is not something that is just, oh, it's popping up against preseason competition. He has looked this good all of training camp. His pass rush is vastly improved. He's still got tons of power. He won with a bull rush today, but you also see the increased burst, this faster burst off the line of scrimmage. He's just playing faster. He's using his hands better. Derek Hall's just getting after it. Let's get to these special teams game balls. And you and I believe are going to share one of these, but I'm going to let you make the pick on special teams, and then I'm going to dish out my own game ball real quick. It feels like this is another week where it was pretty obvious who the selection is.
Yeah, obviously D. Williams had a heck of a kick return there. 2 returns for 68 yards. Obviously, as you saw. And he did perform well on defense, and I'm so curious to see where D. Williams fits in on this defense. I don't know. He's one of the most confusing players here, Corbin, because I don't know if he makes the team as a corner, but he also has shown so much upside as a special teams player that, like, maybe Seattle hangs on to him, as one of those guys that they could develop. Obviously, as a former receiver, he came onto this team as a receiver and then got switched to a corner. There's so much intrigue with D. Williams just as an athlete, and to see what potential he has, both as a defensive player and as a returner. It's just so interesting. He's such an intriguing player to me. And obviously, with that 41-yard kick return, anybody who's standing out right now in the preseason on kick returns immediately becomes an intriguing player just because, okay, you're figuring this out before some other players are. And we haven't seen that from a lot of players so far in preseason. So the fact that D. Williams has been able to do that is excellent. But I'm just so curious where he fits on this team. I don't know if there's a roster spot for him, Corbin. I really don't. But if he's able to squeeze in, I know for a fact he's going to make an impact.
I don't know. He had a pass breakup today. That's more than what most of the corners he was competing against did tonight. And then you add in what he did on special teams. I think he might have improved his chances of making this football team tonight. Real quick, I want to give out the first, and hopefully it'll be the last game ball that we have, the Evander Holyfield game ball, which is going to Ty Okada, Mr. Bloody Ear himself, who had a diving interception with blood all over his jersey and his undershirt today. He also had a quarterback hit on a blitz. So anybody that doesn't get that reference, just look up Evander Holyfield and Mike Tyson, and that should give you an idea. But anyway, that is my winner here for the Evander Holyfield game ball, playing through that injured, bleeding ear and making a diving interception. Ty Okada, who's been under Tennessee's player's skin all week long, gets a last laugh there from that standpoint with a diving pick off a deflection. Let's shift gears now to our 3-up, 3-down, Connor. And as we do each and every week after the game, looking at which players are hot and which ones are not. Let's start on the positive side of things here. And I know from a 3rd-down running back competition perspective, and I tweeted this out earlier, that I think the fact George Halani only got 2 carries in this game and played like 4 snaps, that told me more about where his standing is at than it did anything else. I think the Seahawks already know what they have in him, and they wanted to keep him healthy, especially with Zach Charbonnet being somewhat banged up right now. But it provided an opportunity for Kenny McIntosh to shoulder the load today, and at least from a running and receiving standpoint, he was able to improve his standing for making this roster.
Yeah, I'm impressed with Kenny McIntosh as I have been throughout this preseason, just in terms of his ability as a pure ball carrier. It's one of those difficult situations where, and I also tweeted this out, Corbin, where I just don't see a situation where Seattle can cut either one of these guys, because either one of these guys could be a second string running back on any other team that needs a running back, right, behind their starter. I mean, that's just through and through. Either of these guys could be playing in the NFL in the regular season. And unfortunately, even if they keep both of them, most of them, for the most part, they will not be seeing the field. But you cannot let either one of these guys go. Kenny McIntosh obviously finishes with 8 carries, 46 yards, and he also catches a couple passes for 17 yards. He just looked really good. He looks like such a natural ball carrier. And that's one of the things that is difficult to judge these two guys off of, because Kenny McIntosh is arguably, I'm going to emphasize the word arguably here, Corbin, is arguably the better ball carrier, but George Holani is so much better in pass protection, and that makes such a big difference whenever this coaching staff is trying to cut down this roster. I'm excited from what I saw from Kenny McIntosh. Obviously, we didn't see George Holani a whole lot, but I just don't see a situation where these guys can cut both of, or I'm sorry, cannot keep both of them on this roster at this point. They're so good. I would hate to see either one of them let go at this point.
Yeah, I thought that McIntosh had a really good game running the football, but he should also thank number 75 in front of him, Anthony Bradford. He's in the middle of this competition. Now, Christian Haynes was starting at left guard tonight, so they both got to start. They get to play a lot of snaps together. I've mentioned the last few days that I'm curious about that as a possibility at some point this year. Laken Tomlinson looks like he's going to be the guy to open the season, but do they eventually go that route? But Anthony Bradford, man, he was an IHOP out there on the field today. I counted at least 2 pancakes, but Kenny McIntosh's first big run, a 12-yarder that led up to Howell's touchdown pass to Winston, they showed the replay of this a couple times, and Oluwatimbi deserves credit too, but Bradford just knocked the nose tackle 3 yards off the ball at contact and mauled him. And then Oluwatimbi just was able to seal him. And then there was a massive crease. Nobody even got near Kenny McIntosh until he was 10 yards downfield. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that horse up front that can win as a mauler, can create push, and really can set the tone from a physicality standpoint. And Bradford did that throughout the first half. In the run game, I thought he looked better in pass pro. That was a big reason Sam Howell had the half that he did. So kudos to Anthony Bradford. He got put in the second team on Thursday, and he took that to heart today. Like, hey, I'm still the starting right guard, guys, and I'm going to go out and prove it tonight. So I thought Anthony Bradford played great. And on defense, let's give some love to number 48. Tyrese Knight leads the team with 8 tackles, had a tackle for loss. He blew up a screen, which he showed off KJ Wright-like instincts on that play, blowing up that screen. I thought he made some pretty nice drops back in coverage, really wasn't a liability for Seattle in that standpoint. I just thought we saw some really nice growth from him here in this football game. And even after the game, Mike McDonald was saying, hey, you're not a rookie anymore. It's time to grow up. I feel like he is trying to push to that next level. Hey, you're going to play fairly early this year. So he is taking those strides. I think number 48 had a fantastic game. Really nice one. Tyrese Knight, clearly the class of the linebackers for the Seahawks in this contest.
Yeah, I agree, Corbin. And people are putting way too much weight in this quote that obviously came out this last week from Mike McDonald of it's going to take him 3 years, right? And people are putting so much weight in this of, okay, Tyrese Knight's not going to be ready for 3 years. No, that's not what that quote means. That quote means Tyrese Knight might not be at the peak of his NFL potential for 3 years, because also Mike McDonald is a linebacker guru. That's what he wants to do. He's very, very critical of his linebackers. That's what he's done in the past. This does not mean that Tyrese Knight is not going to be playing in the regular season for 3 years. And I keep on seeing all this stuff on X/Twitter, whatever you want to call it, of Tyrese Knight and what Mike McDonald said about him. That is not where Tyrese Knight is at right now. Tyrese Knight is a player who could start if Seattle needed him to start day one, week one, he could do it. Now, does that mean he's going to be an instant fill-in for Bobby Wagner? No, that does not mean he's going to be as quality of a linebacker as Bobby Wagner or whatever else insert any other player. But at this point, Tyrese Knight has shown enough, both in run defense and in coverage, that he could start week 1 if he needed to. Now, that doesn't mean that's the ideal situation. Obviously, we want Jerome Baker back to start week 1. But if he was not ready, at this point, Tyrese Knight has shown enough to fill in for that spot. I think people need to stop overreacting to this quote from Mike McDonald, because it's been getting a little bit overplayed at this point.
Flipping the script now to our who's not hot here in our 3 up, 3 down. In a losing effort, there's always going to be plenty of names to pick out. And I think that the first 2 that we've got to talk about here, they really go together, because PJ Walker, in his defense tonight, if you were watching the second half, almost every time he dropped back to throw, there was somebody in his face. And I hate to pick on one guy, but a lot of times it was because Garrett Greenfield was getting owned off the left side. He could not keep PJ Walker clean in this game, but the rest of the offensive line had their issues too. So these 2 things really go together. PJ Walker's accuracy, even the 4 completions he had, at least 2 of them were not well-thrown footballs, and they just happened to be in an area where his receiver was able to catch the football or was kept away from the defense. But there was one throw that he made that went about 40 yards out of bounds, it looked like, and trying to figure out where it was going. And I know the offensive line was an issue, but I feel like the Seahawks, the Browns are coming next week, and the Browns have got a couple really good backup quarterbacks. It feels like one of them is going to get cut. The Seahawks might be doing some scouting in game to see, is one of these guys going to be a better option than PJ Walker to have as that 3rd quarterback on the practice squad or even on the 53-man roster here, because Walker has struggled with his accuracy. There were guys getting open today that he was not getting the football to. He wasn't seeing them open. He wasn't getting through his reads comfortably. So this was a 2-handed thing. You have PJ Walker's struggles, and then you have the offensive line, which played a big role in those struggles. To me, those are the 2 groups on offense that get the big thumbs down coming out of this game.
Yeah, and on PJ Walker specifically, Corbin, obviously I texted you about this, but it was just he had similar weapons, not the same offensive line, which we know makes a big difference, but it's not like Sam Howell had a ton of protection throughout the first half as well. And PJ Walker consistently, even with a clean pocket, was just not making the throws on time. You saw a couple of those comeback routes that he threw even just a little bit too early, right? Like before the receiver had even turned his shoulder to come back to the ball. It was a little bit too early. It was not there on time. And I think that was just the level of PJ Walker trying to get the ball out, right? Like the pocket was collapsing. He had to get the ball out. But even when the protection was there, it just didn't look right. And I think there was something with PJ Walker's, the mental side of things for PJ Walker, where something was just a little bit off. And obviously that 3rd-team offensive line, there's a big gap, I think, Corbin, between that 1st and 2nd-team offensive line, the immediate backups, as well as the starters, and those guys who are trying to fight for a roster spot here. Obviously, Garrett Greenfield, you singled out, was pretty much bullied all night, and it wasn't a good look for this team overall. But I am curious to see where PJ Walker fits. I'm not sure if he's going to make the 53-man roster at this point. Obviously, even with the new emergency quarterback setup, I think there's a situation where Seattle just keeps 2 quarterbacks. So I'm intrigued to see how he performs in the 3rd preseason game, depending on how many snaps he gets. We might see Geno Smith in that game, so he might not have as much of an opportunity to come in and prove his worth. But he certainly didn't show much tonight where we're going to be jumping up and down at how PJ Walker did.
And I'm not one that enjoys singling out one player, but as we talked about earlier, look, this was a huge game for the rookie cornerbacks coming in. They got a lot of snaps. Nehemiah Pritchett, I thought, had a decent, not great, but a decent game. He was able to go out there and make a few plays in this game. It was a very difficult night for DJ James. He gave up a touchdown, and then Nick Westbrook took him for a ride the last 5 yards on that slant to power his way to the end zone. He missed a tackle on a 22-yard run earlier in that same drive. He had those 2 back-breaking penalties on defense, the face mask and the defensive hold, which they were both clearly penalties that needed to be called. So it wasn't like, Mike McDonald was whining a little bit in the sidelines about the hold, but I'm sure if he goes back and looks at the film, he's like, well, that's got to be called every time. You can't do that. And, it felt like everything went wrong tonight for DJ James. And when you are in this tight of a competition with this talented a quarterback group, I don't want to sit here and say that he played himself off the roster, but that very well could be the case tonight. I think that it was that bad of a performance with some of the other players that are going to be in that cornerback group. If he goes out and plays well in the third game, maybe he salvages the situation, but there's no denying it. It was an extremely difficult night for the rookie corner out of Auburn.
Yeah, I think the only play that I saw that I liked out of DJ James tonight was that combination tackle with Pritchett near the goal line. That was the only, but he was, that was more so just a reaction that any defensive player could make. And I don't want to downplay anything that an NFL player can do, because that sounds ridiculous when I'm sitting here behind a microphone. But overall, DJ James just did not play well. And it's tough as a 6th round pick where you want to see all these draft picks make the roster. But DJ James, just 2 penalties on 1 drive with only 1 play in between them, the holding and the face mask, coupled with the touchdown allowed. And off coverage is not easy to play, Corbin. Obviously, as we know, there's a lot of different things you have to read and that you have to react to in off coverage. But he reacted so late to Nick Westbrook-Akine's route that it was almost no contest whenever he caught the ball. The fact that he was going to be able to get into the end zone, there was no resistance from DJ James. So I really don't like his chances to make the roster at this point. It sucks because any draft pick, getting relinquished to the practice squad or whatever else, or getting cut completely, which I don't think he'll get cut completely. I think he will be on the practice squad. But at this point, things don't look good for him. I think he just looks a little bit lost out there. I think he looks a little bit overmatched. Pritchett hopefully makes the roster. But this cornerback group, as you mentioned, Corbin, is just so deep that obviously they drafted these corners with the hopes that they could have even more depth at this position and continue to get better and better and better. But so far, even with Pritchett playing pretty well throughout these first 2 preseason games, I think DJ James ends up being the odd man out, as much as that sucks to say.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Connor at C. John Benintendi. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back on Monday, I'll be rejoined by Rob Rang, and we'll have had a chance to dive back into the film, some extra thoughts on today's loss to the Titans in Nashville, and we'll start to transition towards the final week of the preseason, looking towards some training camp practices and who has more to prove going into that final preseason game. Make sure you're listening and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Go Hawks.